Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
It's all a game of politics. There are those who are unaware a game even exists. There are those who know a game exists but choose not to play. There are those who know about the game and will play when necessary. There are those who know the game and play all the time. And then there are those who create the game. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to the most widely watched program on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Dr. Cheryl Richards, filling in for Chris William. Our program today is all about the game of politics. Who you know, what you know, who you know that will get you what you need to know. In just a moment, we turn to our panelists to give us the play-by-play as the current game unfolds.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded June 14th, 2013. On this week's program, Dr. Adolphus Belk Jr. of Winthrop University, Dr. Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, Dr. Laura Olson of Clemson University, and Dr. Susan Roberts of Davidson College.
Welcome. We have a lot of doctors in the house, do we not? Let's see if we can figure out where this game is going this time. Thank you for joining us. Let's start with headlines that are coming out now. We've got Bob Rucho stepping down in North Carolina. Who wants to take a crack at what this means for us?
Well, it's really interesting because this whole dynamic of the House and the Senate really being competitive chambers, and even though they're settling on kind of similar numbers, particularly in regards to the House and the Senate budgets and the tax reform bills, there are substantive differences between the two. And what we're probably going to see play out is this battle within the conference committee. But certainly Senator Rucho put his neck out with his tax reform. You know, it was dealing with increasing and expanding the sales tax, looking at taxing food at higher levels, and really doing a lot of unpopular things, thinking that it would expand the burden onto everybody, and so everybody was going to have their ox gored. Nobody liked it, and Berger came in and basically said, this is going to be the new Senate tax plan to counter the House. And I think Senator Rucho just looked at the dynamics and said, you know what, if you're not going to support my legislation, I won't be your finance chair. Now, you know, he can't resign until the Senate pro tem accepts it, but it's an interesting dynamic going on within the majority Republican Party that really is going to play out over the next couple of weeks with the budget and taxes.
And I just add, it's not nearly as policy-oriented sometimes as it is personality-oriented. They're free now, given that the policy details may differ, but the ideology is the same. And so I think you're seeing the House is not in order and the Senate is not in order. And so I think you're right about the policies and the personalities. Rucho has always been a personality.
Yeah, and the Senate is much more conservative than the House, so that's going to be the interesting dynamic to play out. Insert the governor who's aligning himself much more with the House dynamics than the Senate. It's going to be an interesting couple of weeks to see how that plays out.
And we have no personalities in South Carolina. So, none at all. No. Should we weigh in on the personalities of South Carolina?
Well, I mean, the most dominant right now has been with the governor. And the governor came in, and you have to kind of take a step back for a moment. She was someone that was really fourth in the field of 5 candidates and emerged first getting an endorsement from Mitt Romney, then getting the big boost from Sarah Palin, and at that point began to raise a lot more money, became a more competitive candidate. But she's had her stumbles in dealing with the legislature, and the legislature had a very combative relationship with the previous governor, Mark Sanford. So that's been something that we've been watching, and especially as she's angling for a second term.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right, and kind of, I think, going into that race for a second term for her, one would think, all other things being equal, that we'd be in a situation where she'd probably get reelected, right? Notwithstanding the challenges that she's had in working with the legislature and some of the various little stumbles that she's had and various things she's had to overcome. Again, all other things being equal, just like Sanford gets elected to a House seat just last month. We would think that, you know, all these other things wouldn't matter, but I'm just not so sure. Shaheen, last time Vincent Shaheen ran a very, very close race with her, a much closer race than anyone I think thought was going to be the case. He's running again next year. In the right scenario with the right kind of campaign, I think it's, I mean, certainly not likely, but within the realm of possibility that she might not win that second term, even though, and this is important, even though she's not being challenged in the primary by anyone. For example, Tim Scott, if he had wanted to use this sort of moment of prominence that he's suddenly gotten as the new senator from the state of South Carolina, could have said, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, although that would have been sort of a, thanks so much for putting me in the Senate, now I'm going to challenge you in the primary. Probably not the smartest political move, but nobody's challenging her, which suggests that she's shored her situation up with the base. But again, that doesn't mean that her reelection is necessarily a fait accompli at this point.
Mm-hmm. Opinions?
Well, I look at the Shaheen race. Shaheen ran a good race 4 years ago, and he tried to position himself as a moderate Democrat. I think about the direct mailers that went out, and you see a picture of him in a, you know, shirt, open collar, in a pickup truck, you know, trying to project himself as a sort of everyman South Carolinian kind of thing. And to really moderate and appeal to those independent, those kind of leaning independents, the unaffiliated folk, but ran up against a hot candidate in the closing moments. I think that there are as many Democratic voters in South Carolina as there are Republican voters. The challenge for the Democratic Party is that you have to do something to get those people to the polls, because when you look at the demographics, the people that support the Democratic Party in South Carolina are those persons that are the least likely to vote when compared to their Republican counterparts. So you have to give those people a reason to want to get up, get out, get in line, and turn out for you. And so that the challenge for Shaheen, can he excite those people that were clearly excited by Obama in 2008 when he closed hard in South Carolina?
Well, you know the numbers better than I do, but about a third of South Carolinians are independents or call themselves independents. And they're also the people that aren't going to turn out unless really prodded. And I think, too, if you look at some of the races, the Sanford race, to me, it was a given that he was going to win, given the partisan competition, but you had the turnout question, you had the GOP backing, you had the celebrity opponent. It was fun to watch. It's terrible that we've come to the point that's saying, well, he's not as bad as Anthony Weiner. Mm-hmm. It's terrible. It's a game.
Well, and you know, I mean, nationwide, we're talking about voter turnout in mid-year elections, and you just can't guarantee that. So how's that going to play into this?
Well, when you look at the races in a place like South Carolina makes sure they insulate themselves from what's happening nationally by having these off-year elections, where the governor's not going to be on a ticket with the president. So that means that the things that are happening at the top are not going to influence what happens within our state. So turnout's going to be lower. And that's a given. So the challenge for a candidate is to build the sort of operation that can get people out. And this is where I think you have to blend the old school methods of you know, phone banking, going door to door, canvassing, that sort of thing, with the new school technologies that allow you to identify those likely voters and figure out the best ways to contact them. That's what you saw nationally with the Obama campaign, but he was sitting on $1 billion to build his organization. You're not going to have that kind of money in a gubernatorial race.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see if the national Democrats decide to throw their support behind Vincent Shaheen and say, you know, if this governor is vulnerable, can they take down Nikki Haley? That would be a huge coup for the national Democrats, but they're competing against a typical 6-year itch with voters that don't like usually that turn against the president's party in power, and so that's going to be, I think, a real uphill battle for them.
Well, and also to add on what you said about turnout, there's, between the old school and the new school, there's a school we don't really understand, and that is these new voter disenfranchisement or the new kind of state photo issued IDs, or in North Carolina, efforts to curb early voting, stop same-day registration, and you know, I just think it's really a shame. I can't understand why people would ever want to curb early voting. I mean, I can understand, but I know I'm saying I can't.
We do understand it. When you look at the demographics, we were talking about this earlier amongst ourselves, 50% of the people under the age of 18 in North Carolina are people of color. And that's part of the reason why that state is becoming more competitive in national contests, and eventually those demographic changes are going to be felt across the state level. And so looking at changing demographics, people are saying, well, if we can't get races out of the electorate that we like, how can we fashion a new electorate that can help us to maintain our power? And you look at, and I want to make this point because I think this is important. Nationally, 11% of Americans lack the sort of photo identification that's necessary under many of these laws. But when you look at different populations, for African Americans, it's 25%. For Latinos, it's 20%. It's even higher for some older Americans. So I think it's intentional.
Oh, sure. And I wanted you to want to understand that I just meant civically I can't understand, not politically, because the political and partisan impact is clear as a bell.
It's about who's creating the game.
That's right.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
You write the rules of the game.
Right.
You get to determine in large part.
And also in North Carolina, a lot of states that were on the brink, according to the Brennan Center, of changing are now saying, we'll liberalize a little more. But North Carolina is an exception. They're going full speed ahead with these restrictions.
And it's a solution in search of a problem, because it's more likely, according to the Brennan Center research, that you'll be struck by lightning than to have someone impersonate you at the polls.
Do we have any mojo left in North Carolina? Did we get it back?
I think so. I mean, the 2016 and certainly is going to be another, I think, competitiveness. North Carolina will continue to be a kind of battleground state just because voter registration, that's moving much more to kind of the national norm of a third Democrat, a third Republicans, and third independents. I also think 2014 is going to be an interesting setup to that because of the Kay Hagan race. We've got a very moderate Democrat who is pulling at or about 45% in the polls right now. She's in a good place, but she needs to build up that lead-in into 2014. On the Republican side, we're probably going to have a slew of Republicans throwing their hat into the ring, most notably right now, the Speaker of the North Carolina House, Tom Tillis. There's some question, will the Senate pro tem, Phil Berger, throw his hat into the ring? The likelihood is probably not, because he can become the kingmaker in the next cycle of elections. But if it's a Tom Tillis and Kay Hagan run, it's going to be interesting to see how much Tillis is able to play to the Tea Party faction within the Republican Party, but also not alienate those suburban swing voters that North Carolina is so heavily reliant upon. Urban voters, strongly Democratic; rural voters, strongly Republican. It's an urban-rural divide going on within the state, but the suburbs really kind of create that kind of area of this is where elections get decided.
And in that sense, North Carolina is really a microcosm of the country.
It is.
And this is apropos as well of Professor Belk's point from before about the dramatically increasing diversity. If we're talking about race, if we're talking about ethnicity, if we're talking as well about religion, among younger voters than what we see among older voters. And I think one of the more interesting things that came out of the results of the 2012 presidential election was that the Obama coalition, when you think about age, gender, and religion, age, gender, religion, and race, ethnicity. We think about those four important demographics. The Obama coalition looked an awful lot like the under 29-year-old voting cohort, whereas the Romney electoral coalition looked an awful lot like the 65-plus. Cohort. And I mean, that really gets to the core of the problem for the National Republican Party. How is the party going to go after this younger
in 2012,
generation?
Yeah, in 2012, if you looked at the voters who cast ballots, 18 to 25-year-olds, Republicans came in third in terms of the registered voters casting ballots. That's not a good sign if you're moving more older, whiter among the GOP. That's a real danger sign.
Does that change, though, too, with the 14 election versus the 16 election?
Well, certainly, because here's the thing, that And this is what really shaped, I think, Romney's strategy going into 2012. They looked at that 08 electorate and thought it was an anomaly. Yeah. They thought they could get one more election out of that 2004 presidential electorate that put Bush back in office, and they miscalculated. But and the reason why they miscalculated, they saw what happened in 10. And in 10, that electorate was older, it was better educated, it was higher income, and it was whiter. And so they rode that Tea Party wave in a lot of jurisdictions and had some success. And so they thought, well, maybe we can get one more out of it. Yeah. But they couldn't. Yeah. So some of these demographic changes, I think, are going to be more present in 16. But in 14, off-year election, the electorate contracts, and that makes it easier to turn out the sort of folks that typically support Republicans. Final point here, when we're looking at a statewide race, those persons can have a greater influence. Yeah. When we're looking at congressional races that are out of districts, it's a wrap, because given the gerrymandering that happened in 2010, Republicans have a lot of safe seats. If you look at the outcome of 12, 51% of North Carolinians voted for a Democrat for the House of Representatives, but Republicans took 9 of the 13 seats. That's gerrymandering. And I think that the gerrymandering has made a lot of safe Republican seats, and I think that the influence of campaign money, especially in a post-Citizens United Speech Now world, the money really talks now.
And let's talk about the policy platforms that are different, too, in the 14 election versus the 16 election. It's not just the demographics, right?
Oh, I think not just the demographics. I may say one thing, too, if on everybody's part. If you want to see what went wrong in the last election, look at the new battle plan for the Republicans. It's 100 pages long, but they go through everything from technology to demographics to branding. And I just want to throw that in because I think it is something that's, and plus they do talk in there about their policies, but some of them are how to brand their policies to look like something that they're not.
So it's a branding issue as opposed to a policy.
They reject that, but it is.
That's where people are struggling. I think that there's a real conflict right now within the Republican Party, and they should have been having this conversation after 2008 because the writing was clear then. Yeah. But again, they thought, wait, maybe we can get one more run out of 2004. But here's what's going on. You have the sort of fiscal conservative, national security conservative, but socially moderate Republicans being pitted against those who are more socially conservative. And so the moderates are like, if we would have allowed Romney to run as the moderate he really is, we would have fared better. The conservatives are saying, no, the problem is that you run 2 moderates back to back now in McCain and Romney, and you can't win with them. You're trying to be the Democrats' light, and it's not going to cut it. You need a more conservative candidate. So that argument's taking place right now, and you hear people like Bobby Jindal, when they came to the Charlotte area, saying we can no longer be the party of stupid, saying that we have to if we're going to be taken serious, we have to have serious policy proposals. But the problem is that with some of the proposals, they might hurt the same people you're trying to go after, looking at what's happening with immigration reform in particular.
Let's talk about that immigration reform in South Carolina, hitting headlines right now.
Well, I mean, as it is in every state, right? And I just want to speak to this issue, I think, in a broad way. If the Republicans are on the wrong side of history on this count, it's going to be a real problem for them going forward. And I hate to bring this back again to demographics because, you know, it isn't all about demographics, right? But demographics inform policy, and where one party or the other lands on policy ends up affecting perhaps generations to come. And the biggest, fastest growing minority, in quotes, group in this country are Latino and Latinas. And President Obama very successfully went after them in 2012. And if in South Carolina in general, or in general, I should say, if immigration reform doesn't happen in a serious way, if the Republicans don't agree to play ball on that issue, it's going to be a real big problem for them going ahead.
Isn't it a pity that now we take great pride in the fact it can come up for a vote? Not that anything, but we agreed that we can vote on it in the Senate. And I think, too, what you were saying about immigration and what you were saying about demographics, it is part of a whole. I think that we look at North Carolina, and we're going to talk about North Carolina politics. There was an article that was, very interesting about North Carolina is the new Wisconsin, about the fact that, hey, we don't have collective bargaining. And it was talking about the moral Mondays that were happening, and there's a hue and cry, but I don't know if the legislature's listening.
Here's what makes the Latino population special in a lot of places. First, growing population, and with a growing population, that means that there are more votes to be had. Second, this is a population, unlike African Americans, that's in play for the Republican Party. Frederick Douglass once said about the Republican Party for African Americans, the Republican Party is the deck, all else is the sea, suggesting that at that time the Democratic Party didn't present blacks with a viable alternative. If you look at the circumstance today, for African Americans, the Democratic Party is the deck, all else is the sea. They do not see a viable alternative in the GOP. But for Latino voters, the Republican Party's been in play. I go back to 2004 with George Bush. George Bush increased his performance with Latinos 9% from 2000 to 2004. He got 44% of the Latino vote. You look at what happened to John McCain and Mitt Romney, they're getting lower and lower and lower. And a lot of that is being driven by the way that people are talking about Latinos with the immigration reform. So if people mess this up, they're not just losing current Latino voters, they're losing a generation or two.
That's right. So and they're overcoming, they're overcoming the real kind of basic challenge in trying to appeal to Latinos and Latinas, which is that different groups who come from different countries of origin don't always see themselves as being on that same ship, right? So I'm Cuban American, or I'm Dominican, or I'm Mexican, or whatever I am. That's more sort of central than I'm Latino. What does that even mean, right? But the more immigration reform becomes this sort of polarized issue, the more you sort of, through that narrative, push Latinos kind of more cohesively into the same corner.
Well, with access to abortion cuts one way with Hispanic Latino voters, and then the size and scope of government, and programs about education. So they're, as you point out, they're a complex portrait.
All right, so you each get about 20 seconds. I'm going to give you 20 seconds. Keep to it here. What's your advice to the state? Take your state, North Carolina, South Carolina. What is your advice to the state? 20 seconds.
20 seconds. They should listen to, legislatures should listen to the public on gun control.
Okay.
I think that people have to get to the people's business. I think Americans nationally and at the state level are disgusted by the level of backbiting and politicking, and people elect folks to take action on serious, real problems. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and they need to do it.
It's not just about jobs. It's about creating jobs and sustaining jobs in a place that people want to be. So cuts to education, cuts to the arts, cuts to things of that nature, cuts to higher education, to speak my own language here, are dangerous and ought to be not taken lightly.
When you're playing the game of politics, numbers don't lie. And the demographics and the change that the society is going through, and in particularly North Carolina continuing to be a battleground state, Republicans have to be careful they don't pitch too far to one side or to the other. Democrats have to figure out how they're going to get back into the game and be a viable voice against the Republican dominance right now.
So let's say we're going to take all of this academic wisdom here around the table. We got all the brain power, and we get to create the game. Right? What is that game? What do the moves look like? What do the plays look like? How do we script it so that we don't cut arts and we don't cut education, and we get all of the voices in the room and we take a stance on gun control?
I'll give you in 1 second. A game that I still can't understand is lacrosse. So it would be lacrosse or maybe cricket, because I still don't understand it. And the score matters in the end, but I don't, you have some better ideas about the game.
I think one of the biggest things is to confront the partisanship that we see through gerrymandering. When we stack the deck, it is inevitable you're going to get what you put into a district. And I think, the discussions about an independent commission here in North Carolina, I think, you just take the numbers, you don't worry about voter trends, you don't worry about voter registration, you draw the maps as they are. Now, the big question is going to be, what is the Supreme Court going to do, probably by the time this airs, about the Voting Rights Act? And that's going to be a huge, monkey wrench that could potentially throw everything.
Well, I'll just say one thing very quickly. I used to think reform of campaign finance was it, but it's reform on gerrymandering. That's where it ought to be.
Yeah, and for our voters to understand, you do reapportionment every 10 years. So you take the data from the census and you figure out which states have gained population, which states have lost population, and you have a shuffling of the deck at the national level when we look at Congress, and maybe even a shuffling of the deck in our state legislatures. But then there's the matter of how do you draw districts? And if a party holds political power, they're going to draw the districts in a way that advantage their particular party and make it a little tougher on the opposition. So they might put more of their party members in the seat in the district for a member of the other party they don't like. So let's say if Democrats have control, we want to put in more Republicans.
We're going to have to wrap it up. It's a great point. We'll have to save it for next time. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.